The call came while I was washing a mug I'd been using for 7 years. Same kitchen. Same window above the sink. My mother's number lit up the screen like something I'd been bracing for without realizing it. "Renata," she said, and her voice had that thinness people get when they're holding themselves very carefully. "Your sister is in the hospital. Acute liver failure. The doctors are saying we don't have much time." I set the mug down. I didn't answer right away. "They tested us all," she continued, filling the silence herself, the way she always had. "You're a match. You're the only one who can help her." Outside the window, the neighbor's dog was barking at something in the dry grass. I watched it and thought about how my daughter Mila used to press her whole face against that same glass, fogging it up. She'd done that the week before the diagnosis. And the week of it. And for 3 weeks after, until she couldn't get out of bed anymore to try. "I'll think about it," I told my mother. Which was not the same as yes. She heard the difference. "My name is Renata Voss. I'm 41 years old. I spent 12 years as a healthcare compliance auditor. The kind of work where you read contracts the way some people read warnings on medication bottles, word by word, because the space between words is where the damage lives. I understood systems. I understood how money moved through institutions and how people described that movement to make it sound like something other than what it was. My daughter Mila got sick when she was 7. A rare autoimmune condition that attacked her joints and eventually her kidneys. There was a treatment program, a specialist center in another state, a protocol that was new enough to be expensive and established enough to work. The center's coordinator was kind. The number she gave us was not. My husband and I did everything you do. We sold things. We applied for programs. We held a fundraiser in a church gymnasium where I smiled until my face ached because that's the bargain. You offer your grief as entertainment and people give you something in return. We got close. We got agonizingly, specifically close. I called my parents from the parking lot of the medical center. Mila was in the back seat, quiet in the way children get when they've spent too much time listening to adults sound scared. "We're short," I told my mother. 60,000. We can't start the protocol without the full amount." "Mom, you have it." "I know you have it." She didn't answer immediately. I could hear her breathing. "Renata," she finally said, "that's a significant sum." My father's voice came in behind hers, measured. "Managed. We've made commitments. Our assets aren't liquid. We're not going to jeopardize our financial position on an unproven course of treatment." "It's not unproven. It's her kidneys. She's 7. We understand that." He said it the way people say it when they don't want to understand anything. "But we have to be rational. We have to think about the long term." I looked in the rearview mirror. Mila had her eyes closed. She'd learned to rest in cars because sitting up took something out of her. "Please," I said. One syllable. I had nothing else. They said no. They hung up with the certainty of people who have decided that careful is the same thing as good. Here's what they didn't account for. I am very good at reading documents. My parents used a shared cloud drive the way some families use a junk drawer. Everything dumped in together, nothing organized, photos next to tax forms next to whatever they'd scanned that week. I had access because we'd all used it for years. I don't know what made me look. Grief, maybe. Or the part of grief that turns into something colder when you realize it doesn't have to be this way. I found a portfolio summary in a folder labeled Household 2019. I opened it at 11 at night, sitting in Mila's room while her breathing machine cycled through its soft rhythm. The numbers were clear. The accounts were substantial. And nested inside the largest one were transfer records. Neat, dated, confident, moving funds into a named account. My sister Daria's name. Regular intervals. The timestamps were not ambiguous. The day I'd called them from the parking lot, a transfer. 3 days later, when the medical center had called about the deadline, another. The week Mila's labs had dropped below the threshold for standard care, a third. I called my father the next morning and read him the dates. I did not cry. That's the thing about auditing, you learn that the document is the argument. You don't have to perform the argument. He didn't deny it. He reframed it. Those funds were already committed. You committed them after I asked you, I said. We have a responsibility to Daria's future. You made a choice about whose future mattered more. My mother began to cry. Loudly. In the particular way that means she wanted the crying to do the work that logic couldn't. Don't make us into villains. You don't understand the whole picture. I have the statements, I said. I understand the picture exactly. I drove to their house 2 days after that. I brought a folder. I set it on their kitchen counter, the same counter where my father used to stand and explain compound interest to me when I was a teenager, as though money were a kind of virtue. The paper made a sound on the granite. He looked at the first page and then looked away. Where did you get these? The shared drive, I said. The one you use like a filing cabinet, that's private. Yes, I said. Mila's medical records were private too. You still weighed in on them. I pointed to the highlighted dates. I had used yellow, the same color I use at work when something needs to be found again quickly. My father's jaw moved. He said the word committed again like it was a talisman. I told him there were 4 financial instruments that could have produced $60,000 in liquidity within 48 hours without disturbing a single underlying position. I knew this because it was my job to know this. I named them. I watched his expression shift from dismissal to something quieter and more honest. You won't risk your comfort, I said. That's the actual sentence. Say it that way. He didn't. Nobody in my family has ever said the actual sentence. They say the polished version and wait for you to accept the translation. Mila died on a Thursday morning. The light was gray and ordinary, the kind of light that has no interest in being significant. The monitor made it sound. My husband put his hand over his mouth and stood very still, like if he didn't move, time wouldn't either. At the service, my parents wore grief like something they'd borrowed. My mother told me Mila was at peace. My father said something about her strength. I stood beside a small white casket and felt a door close inside me. Not dramatically, not with feeling, just a mechanism completing its motion. Afterward, the messages came. She would want you to forgive us. Families carry each other through the hard times. We made the only decision we could. I changed my number 6 weeks later. Not as a statement. As a boundary. The way you move a piece of furniture away from a draft. 5 years passed. I went back to work. I learned to eat lunch with colleagues who talked about their children's soccer tournaments, and I learned to make the right face when they did. I kept Mila's red rain boots in the coat closet. I wasn't ready to move them, and I decided I didn't have to be. Then my mother called from the hospital, and I took the call because I'd always known somewhere that I would. I drove there. My sister Daria was in a bed with tubes tracking in and out of her, looking smaller than I remembered. My mother grabbed my hands in the hallway. My father stood to the side with his arms crossed, as though the whole situation were an inconvenience he'd agreed to attend. You're her only chance, my mother said. The doctors say a living donor is the only option. I looked at my sister's face through the window. You're asking me, I said, to take a risk you weren't willing to take. This is different. The amount is different, I said. The math is the same. My father stepped forward. If you refuse, you'll have to live with that. I turned to look at him. So will you, I said. You've been doing it for 5 years. I've watched you manage it. I had the evaluation done. I answered the psychologist's question about whether I felt pressured with more honesty than she expected. I signed the forms, and in the space where they asked for my reason, I wrote what was true. Not for them. For myself. For the person I intend to stay. The night before the surgery, I lay in a hospital bed and thought about Mila pressing her face to the kitchen window. I thought about how close we'd gotten. I thought about what it cost to become the kind of person who hides a decision inside a word like responsible. When I woke up, my sister was stable. The surgeon said the procedure had gone well. My mother came into the room with her hands folded and said, "You saved her." I gave her a chance, I said. Those aren't the same thing. She sat down. Can we begin again? Can we try? I looked at the ceiling for a moment. No, I said. But you can stop pretending you had no choice. That's available to you if you want it. My father came in later and said I would hold this against them for the rest of their lives. I told him I wasn't holding it against them. I was holding it in plain sight, where it couldn't be papered over. Daria recovered. She came to see me at my apartment 3 months later. I'd moved into a smaller place, quieter with better light. She sat at my table and said, I didn't know what they did. Not until recently. Maybe that's true. The betrayal didn't require her knowledge to have happened. I offered her tea and we talked about other things. I tell this now because people expect a lesson that fits on a card. Here's what I actually learned. The word responsible does a lot of work in families. It carries money and history and love arranged in a particular order. When someone uses it to explain why they didn't help you, it's worth asking what exactly they were being responsible to. If you've ever been handed that word when you needed something else, what did you do with it?